On. Good evening, everybody. Let's pick up in 2 Kings chapter 22. The parallel account is in 2 Chronicles chapter 34. We're looking at the life of Josiah tonight, and not just Josiah, but the final kings of Judah. We're going to see the demise of the kingdom basically tonight. Next week will be our review for the final and kind of a catch-up class. Actually, the review is scheduled for 2 weeks from tonight, but we'll do some catch up and talk about some of the other prophets that are contemporaries to Josiah and successors, men like Ezekiel, Daniel, Jeremiah, and so forth. And then we'll start our review for the final next week. So, Josiah, the son of Ammon, who was assassinated, the only king in Judah to have that dubious distinction of being assassinated. That was a fairly common occurrence in Israel, and understandably so, because they did not have a legitimate dynasty. Jeroboam blew that up by turning away from God. So Ammon is the only Judean king or Judan king who is actually assassinated by his own people. And Josiah, his son, is appointed king in his place. Now, Josiah is just a youngster, just a child, and he is strongly influenced by the priesthood, the high priest of that era, and so forth. And the thing that sets Josiah apart from his father and grandfather and a number of his ancestors is that he is a righteous king. From his youth, he begins to try to do right. In the 18th year of King Josiah, verse 3 says, so at that point, he's 26 years old. He sent Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, son of Meshullam, the secretary to the house of the Lord, to Hilkiah, the high priest. You go and put things right, set things in order. You flip over to 2 Chronicles for just a moment, and notice in 2 Chronicles chapter 34, in verses 3 through 7, not only does he want to correct the abuses that have been going on, not only does he want to repair the temple, but he actually destroys the places of idolatrous worship in Judah, and not just in Judah, but even into the territory of Israel. Now, bear in mind, Israel is not there anymore. They've been conquered by the Assyrians and carried away into captivity. Heathen people have been planted in their place, but Josiah goes into their territory and even despoils places of idolatrous worship there, and fulfilling the prophecy that was foretold 340 some odd years earlier. He defiles the altars of idolatry in and around Jerusalem and Judah by burning the bones of false prophets on those altars, defiles them for any further use in idolatry. So he's a good king. He starts out well. He stays doing well. Repairs the temple here in chapter 22, verses 3 through 7. Back in chapter 12, Jehoash had also wanted to clean up and straighten out and repair the temple, and had made some moves in that direction, but did not basically get the job finished at that point. Here, Josiah, where Joash had to deal with a priesthood that was somewhat corrupted and dragging their feet in carrying out his instructions, here Josiah has a priesthood that are honest, that are committed to doing the right thing, not because the king says it, but because it's the right thing to do. And so working together, that facilitates, that simplifies things greatly on Josiah's part. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. It's during the reign of Josiah that the prophet Jeremiah will come to prominence. And during Josiah's reign, 31 years, during the basically the second half, about the last 15 years, Jeremiah will be a familiar figure in Josiah's court, a welcome figure. And we'll talk about that more next week. But here in the first half, in the early period, we're focused on restoring the temple, correcting things, cleaning things up, getting things right. And you pick up down here at verse 8, Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. And Shaphan the secretary came to the king and reported to the king, your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house, have delivered it into the hand of the workmen who sought oversight, and Hilkiah has given me a book. And he read it to the king. The book of the law. What did Hilkiah actually find? What do you think?
I couldn't get my sound turned on.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Miss Mary.
I always assumed he found the Pentateuch.
The writings of Moses. That would be the reasonable assumption, but and that's typically what was described as the law. But wouldn't that have been something common?
Apparently,
Should have been.
Should have. There you go. There's the key. It should have been. Remember that one of the requirements for the king was to have a copy of the law and to make a copy in his own handwriting. But we don't find that that was a very common practice, apparently, even though it was supposed to be required. And what had been going on for 50 odd years before Josiah becomes king. You've got Ammon, his father, who only reigned a couple of years, but you've got Manasseh, his grandfather, who reigned for 50 plus years. And what was the character of the kingdom during their lives?
well, Manasseh had undone everything good that his father Hezekiah had done.
Yeah.
And even Manasseh humbled himself, and God restored him to his position to undo all the bad he had done.
Yeah.
55 years wasn't even close to enough time.
Well, and we don't know at exactly what point he began that corrective change. So, even if it were in the middle of his reign, let's just divide this in half and say 25 and a half years of evil and 25 and a half years of repentance. It takes a lot longer to clean up a mess than it does to make a mess, doesn't it? And more likely, Manasseh is near the end of his reign at the point that he repents. And so he's probably spent 40 or 45 years making the mess. And then he has 5 or 10 years to try to reverse course. You've got whole generations that have been affected in that respect. And you've got all the damage that has been done that can't be reversed overnight. So by the time Josiah comes along, even the priesthood has been strongly affected. Now he's dealing with an upright group of priests, but not all of them are following that example. So we find the book of the law, a copy, presumably, of the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, the words of Moses. Is it the autographs, the original copy? I don't know. It's something that has been out of use and out of sight for a long time. Notice the reaction. Shaphan reads it, takes it to the king, and at verse 11, when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes and commanded Hilkiah the priest, and Jehoiakim the son of Shaphan, and Akbor the son of Micaiah, and Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah the king's servant, go inquire of the Lord for me, and for the people, and for all of Judah, concerning the words of this book that has been found. Great is the wrath of the Lord that's kindled against us. Now, we would assume Josiah is a good king, therefore he knows the law. And yet from these words, even though his character is attested as being good, it appears that he is somewhat ignorant until he hears these things. He's somewhat ignorant of some of the things that are required of both he as the king and the people. The law is brought, the law is read, and here's a point that we don't want to overlook at verse 11. It's plain enough to be understood. How many people have you encountered in the course of your life who, where the Bible is concerned, maybe even Christians, where the Bible is concerned, just basically say, well, I just can't understand it. I just don't know how to, it's just too complicated for me. It's too hard to understand. Well, if you have a typical late 20th, early 21st century education, and you read like a typical high school graduate within the last 25 years, and somebody hands you a King James Bible, they might have a little bit of a point that it is hard for them to understand. But guess what? You've got options. You can always get a New King James or an English Standard. You can get a modern speech translation that can be read and understood in modern English.
Brother Dave?
Yes, ma'am.
My take on comments like that are that they are a direct insult to God, because if this is God's word and he wants us to understand it,
Yep.
don't you think he's wise enough to have it in a presentable form for us?
Absolutely. Here's the thing. When somebody says, oh, I just can't understand that, they're not saying it cannot be understood. What they're really doing is telling on themselves and saying, I'm not willing to put any effort into it, or I'm not willing to put enough effort into it. Now you go over to 2 Peter, and Peter does make the observation in 2 Peter chapter 3 that some of the things that the Apostle Paul wrote are difficult to understand. They're challenging. Paul himself says in Philippians chapter 3, I have not yet leveled off in my understanding of God's word. I haven't got all the pieces and parts put into place so that I understand absolutely everything there is to understand. But neither of them said it could not be understood. And in fact, when Peter talks about some of the things Paul wrote that are hard to understand, what's he talking about? Paul deals in his various writings with some enormous theological concepts. It takes some effort to understand those things. Look at Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus in John chapter 3. Oh, teacher, we know that you're a teacher come from God. No man can do the things you do unless God is with him. And what does Jesus say to him? He doesn't say, that's right, I'm from God. He says, except a man is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. This, to a man who in his own mind is the epitome of what it is to be in the kingdom of God. That was a hard concept for Nicodemus to grasp. Jump down to John chapter 6. After Jesus has fed the 5,000 and the 4,000, multitudes are following him because of the loaves and the fishes. Now Jesus begins to teach some more demanding things than he had been teaching. And how did the multitude respond? Many of them turned back and walked no more with him. Their complaint was, this is a hard saying, who can understand it? Not that it's not understandable, it's challenging, it's demanding. Oh, you're requiring something of us now instead of just handing out food and talking to us. Who can understand that? Well, it can be understood, but we have to have the want to, the commitment, the determination to do that. And right here in verse 11 in 2 Kings chapter 22, when the law was read, this young man, Josiah, understood. He understood what was read. He understood what the implications of it were. And so he sends the high priest and others to find out, what do we need to do? Now, notice down here in verses 13, 14, where they go. This is interesting. Hilkiah and Jehoiakim and Achbor and Shaphan and Asaiah went to Huldah the prophetess, the wife of Shallum the son of Tikvah, son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the second quarter, and they talked with her. They went to a prophetess. Why? Who is this Huldah the prophetess? I had a sixth grade teacher whose name was Huldah. I'd never heard that name at that point. I was amazed to discover that's a biblical name. Of course, that was when I was a child. But they go to inquire of someone who can give them an answer. How is it that there is a prophetess in Jerusalem?
I assume because God never left them alone.
Okay, well, God never left them alone, but why not a prophet?
Well, why not a prophetess? There are other female prophets throughout the Bible.
There were. I would suggest a possible explanation being that circumstances in Manasseh's and Ammon's reigns were so miserably poor that men that could have and perhaps should have served as prophets did not step up to meet the challenge that God placed before them. One thing to keep in mind is that no prophet ever served unwittingly or against his will. God never possessed and forced anybody in that role. But go back to the days of the judges in the time of Barak, who had to hold his hand to get him to do what God wanted him to do? He had to have Deborah. And Deborah judged Israel. Why did they have Deborah judging Israel, the wife of Lapidoth, instead? Where is Lapidoth? Why isn't he the judge? Apparently he won't step up. In those circumstances, God enabled who would do the job. And in this case, here you have Huldah the prophetess. And they talked with her, and she said, this is what the Lord says. Tell the man who sent you, I will bring disaster on this place, its inhabitants, all the words of the book that the king of Judah has read, because you've forsaken me and made offerings to other gods, and they provoked me to anger, and therefore my wrath will be kindled. But to the king of Judah who sent you to inquire regarding the words you've heard, because your heart is penitent and you humbled yourself, this will not happen in your lifetime. I'll gather you to your fathers in peace. So, sort of a two-part prophecy. God's cup of wrath is getting close to the brim. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that whenever Judah, whenever a king turned things around, like Hezekiah or Jehoash or Josiah, and improved things, even though the nation went the direction the king was requiring of them, that does not indicate that all their hearts were turned in that direction. Just as in the days of Elijah complains to God, I alone am left of all the people in Israel. Well, what does God show him? No, I've still got 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. But the majority had. And here, just as the nation is going to turn around and God will bless them and things will be good by and large while Josiah is king, that does not mean that every heart is on the same page with him. He's the king, so they go along. But what happens when he dies? They're going to reverse course just almost in a flash. And that tells you a lot about the condition of the hearts of the people. When God, through Huldah, speaks to wrath to come, what's he taking account of? It's not just the heart of the king that's being judged here. It's the heart of all the people. And the nation as a whole has not kept faith with God. The people as a whole have indulged and embraced idolatry. Jeremiah will tell us in Jeremiah chapter 24 of God's relationship with his people when the nation divides. Here is Israel, the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. God describes them as my wife, and they're unfaithful. And so I divorced her and married her sister. Here's Judah. And Judah, far from being a model faithful wife, what does God have Jeremiah say about Judah? Why, they were worse than Israel. And that's why they went into captivity. So God gives judgment for Judah and for Josiah. Flip over to Second Chronicles chapter 34 for a minute and pick up at verses 22 through 28. And here they go to Huldah, the wife, the prophetess, the wife of Shallum, and so forth. And this is almost word for word the same. To the king of Judah, because your heart was tender, here's what will happen. You will not live to see this. You shall not see the disaster that I will bring on this place. And they brought back word to the king. So God will spare him the agony of seeing his nation demolished in captivity. God judges him according to the condition of his heart and the actions that he takes. And in that respect, his judgment is different than the nation as a whole. He is spared seeing what happens. Wrath to Judah for their apostasy, but peace to Josiah for his faithfulness. So flip over to chapter 23, and now we begin to read about the reforms that Josiah makes. The first thing he does is have the law read in public. Now this is reminiscent of I apologize, his name just went right out of my mind. Ezra. This is reminiscent of Ezra chapter 7 and the actions that take place there. But we read of Ezra, he read in the law diligently and set his heart to seek God and to do his word and to teach in Israel statutes and ordinances. Now you get over to Nehemiah chapter 8. This is, of course, after the exile. And what do Ezra and Nehemiah do? They read the law in the hearing of all the people. Well, here, the same thing takes place long before that event. All the elders of Judah and Jerusalem are gathered to him, went up to the house of the Lord, with him all the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, great and small, and he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found. And the king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart, all his soul, to perform the words of this covenant that are written in the book. And notice what it says at the end of verse 3. All the people joined in the covenant. Now that's significant, if only because as soon as Josiah dies, what are they going to do? They're going to reverse course. One of the fundamental things in the law that he's reading here, as we get to Exodus chapter 20, God gives what we call the 10 commandments. You don't swear falsely. You don't bear false witness. You don't take an oath that you don't keep. You do not forswear your oaths. They renew the covenant. How many of the people do you suppose are simply going along with this because that's what the king commands. That's what the king expects. It's not necessarily what they want to do. It's just what the king expects. They confirm their pledge to the Lord. You have a parallel to this in 2 Chronicles 34, 29 through 32, almost word for word the same. But now pick up at verse 4, and for the next 21 verses, we have a record of Josiah eradicating idolatry in Judah. The stunning thing about this is not that there was so much idolatry to cleanse, at least not to my thinking. The stunning thing about this is that as soon as Josiah dies, his successors bring it all back in and more, right into Jerusalem proper. But start in verse 4. The king commanded Hilkiah, the high priest, and the priests of the second order, and the keepers of the threshold to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, for the host of heaven. And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron, and carried their ashes to Bethel. Deposed the priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to make offerings at the high places in the cities of Judah and around Jerusalem, those also who burned incense to Baal. So we're destroying the idols and the things that are associated with Baal worship in Jerusalem, and not just in Jerusalem, in the temple. That's the thing that's just mind-boggling to me, that they would go right into the temple of the Lord and do these things. On the other hand, there's a thought, an idea perhaps, that we see embodied in that we can bring into practice in our understanding of the religious world around us. Why would they bring the worship of Baal and the Asherah and all of these things into the temple of the Lord? Why would they not go next door, across the street, or up the hill or whatnot, and build a separate temple? What do you think?
They saw them as equivalent, or maybe even superior.
Okay, maybe they see them as equivalent or superior. What else? Here's the thought, the little seed that I want to plant just to chew on. False religion cannot stand on its own. False religion cannot flourish on its own. It's parasitic. It leans on the truth of God. It perverts it, it twists it, it warps it, it stands it on its head. Isaiah says, woe to those who put evil in the place of good and put good in the place of evil, turn things upside down. But false religion is parasitic in its nature. Think about the most effective ways that Satan, over the past 2,000 years, has managed to undermine the church. It has not been through head-on frontal assault. For the most part, how has he undermined the kingdom of God? From within. Raising up ideas and concepts and individuals inside the church, try to corrupt it from the inside out. Now here, these people go in and basically co-opt the temple of the Lord for their own purposes. Too lazy, too cheap to build their own temple, perhaps. But they're trying to stamp onto the house of the Lord what they want to see there, not what God has ordained to be there. Look at the denominational community around us, and what do you see? People who want to stamp onto God, onto his kingdom, what they want, not what he wants. And so when you appeal, go back to the Bible, a lot of times people don't want that. We want what we want. Well, Sam, you started to say something?
I was just going to say that, you're saying that false religion can't stand on its own. It's parasitic, and that's true. How they twist things to their own understanding, and the more we listen to it, we can hear it, and it sounds so good that we believe it. It sounds the same, but it's not the same. It's twisting words.
That's right.
So that they think we're talking about the same thing.
That's right. Whether it's
just like in Galatians when those troublemakers were following the Jews and they were preaching first part of Galatians, when they say that they, in order to be saved, you still have to be circumcised.
Yep.
Adding stuff to it. And if you didn't know any better, you would think that was all it was, that you still had to be circumcised to be a Christian.
Well, and what does Paul say? Peter and even Barnabas were carried away with that. They bought into it because it sounded good, it sounded reasonable, based on their background and their emotional tie to that background. And so he says, I withstood them to the face.
It caters to the lust, just like with Eve in the garden. There's an inner desire, to have knowledge and stuff like that. So,
and it's the desire to be in charge. What's the hardest thing for many people about being children of God?
Submission.
I beg your pardon?
Oh, sorry, darling. I was saying submission.
There you go. Submission. Letting God be God. Look at the atmosphere of the first world, the Western society around us, and what do you see in the green agenda and the socialist movements and so forth in our society? Really, what you see is people's desire to be God. Look at the changes that have taken place in the Protestant world, just within that narrow frame of Christendom, all those religions that call themselves Christian, that fit into Protestantism. And look at the things that have been embraced in the past 50 years, from women priests and pastors and so forth, to homosexual marriage and living without, as they used to say, without benefit of clergy, so to speak, without being married, and things that are embraced. And, oh, well, this has got to be okay with God because we like it.
Two things I'd like to say. You mentioned false religion being parasitic. A good example of how a parasite works is how the homosexual community has tied themselves to blacks and to there's some other group, but the
civil rights movement's what they've tried to call it for their own purposes, and it has no connection.
No, because the civil rights movement is a valid movement, and it has the point of that is that these are creatures with innate similarities and differences with all people in the world, and so we do need to remember. I like to think of Adam and Eve as having a whole bunch of different colors of children.
Yeah.
Maybe they didn't, but that's how I think of it.
Well, anyway, what color were Adam and Eve?
Yeah, but when you bring up the homosexuality, it's like if you disagree with them, then you're alienating your black brothers and sisters, and
there's no connection between the two.
No.
One is a choice and one is a coincidence.
Yeah, and the other thing is, you ask what I was thinking about our free will. I've heard some people say that we really don't have a free will because God's going to punish us, but that's not true. And how important it is to understand that that's the one thing that we can give God that he doesn't have is our will.
Submission.
Yeah.
He could force it on us.
No.
By the way, if for those who say there is no free will, that God's going to punish us anyway, is he going to punish little children?
Nope.
If they were right, he would punish little children. Now, Calvinism says God will punish innocent little children because they're not innocent. They bear the stain of Adam's sin. But the problem there is Calvinism is wrong.
Right.
That's not wrong.
That's right. Yeah, it's selective justice. People want justice for themselves. So like, if somebody stole from you, you want that criminal to be caught and you want to be put back in right standing. But when God does it, then he's being a bully.
We want to be the administrators of justice. We don't want to be the recipients of it. When I'm the one in the dock, I want mercy. But when you're the one in the dock, I want justice. We're not, the legs of the lame are not equal. Just put it that way.
And Dave, just like the Quran had leapfrogs on the Bible, the Bible was out a long time before the Quran came out. But yet they got, when they talk about the same people, they put in different where they talk about the prophets differently.
Yeah.
But this story had already been written.
Yeah.
And now they come along and talk about it and try to rewrite.
They try to write it to suit themselves.
Yes, they try to rewrite the story.
Yeah. Talking about the whole notion of parasitism, let's narrow this down for just a moment. I'm going to make an observation here, and you can take it for what it's worth. But I think I'm safe in saying this. Within the church, within the Lord's church, we know that there is a spectrum of belief, even within the church, from what we would describe as very conservative on one hand to quite liberal at the other extreme. And where you fall in that spectrum, you define that. But think about this. Even within the church, evil only thrives by parasiting those congregations that are sound in the faith. Think about this. How many congregations have you known that have been sound and solid and flourishing and growing, and someone with an agenda, or maybe a group of someone's with an agenda, take that congregation and push it one direction or the other so that their agenda becomes the focus of everything in that congregation and comes to be the characteristic by which that congregation is known.
Millennialism.
Yeah, millennialism, the non-institutional doctrines, the ecumenical doctrines at the other end that say we can have fellowship with the Baptists, the Methodists, and so on and so forth. Those movements, generally speaking, cannot establish themselves and stand on their own. They gain a foothold by getting established in an existing congregation and then trying to drive it in their particular direction. They're not evangelistic in the world. They're evangelistic among the brethren for their particular agenda.
They're like like women will probably understand this reference. God is like the designer purse, and then they're like the faux purse. They're like the fake purse. You know what I mean? It's like it's like if you never had the designer, you would never have a replica.
Okay.
I like
take your
analogy. I really like that analogy. Thank you.
I will just take y'all's word for that one. I think you and I better keep the Passover there. Anyhow, come back over here to chapter 23 in 2 Kings. Josiah burned down the groves. He broke down, look at verse 7 down here. After he is done defiling all of the altars and so forth of this nonsense. You look at verse 6, he brought out the Asherah from the house of the Lord, burned it at the brook Kidron, beat it to dust, cast it on the graves of the common people. Look at verse 7. He broke down the houses of the Sodomites. The English Standard says the male cult prostitutes who were in the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the Asherah. Imagine what was going on right there in the temple complex. You had ritual prostitution, ritual sodomy for these idols. You had the manufacturing of stuff associated with this right there. And he brought all the priests out of the cities of Judah and defiled the high places where the offerings were made, and broke down the high places, and on it goes. Look at verse 10. He defiled Molech. He defiled Topheth in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no one might burn his son or daughter as an offering to Molech. That's the area to the south, the valley to the south of Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem sits on a promontory that juts out between a north-south and a more or less east-west valley that form the corner of it. The pinnacle of the temple stands on the high point there. The valley to the east is the Kidron Valley with the Gihon Spring just across the valley. The valley to the south is the valley of Hinnom, and Josiah defiles that because that's where these altars are. That remains defiled from this point forward, and it becomes, in the first century, the garbage dump. When Jesus talks about the area where the fire does not go out and where the worm never dies, Gehenna, you can look over into the valley of Hinnom, and there it is. There's where the fire never goes out, the worm never dies, the larva and so forth, because they have to keep burning the trash for sanitation's sake. That's the defiled area. And that's where these altars and so forth had been. Verse 11, he destroys the sun worship, the horses and so forth that had been dedicated to the sun at the entrance to the house of the Lord by the chamber of Nathan-Melech, the chamberlain. He burns the chariots of the sun and breaks down Manasseh's altars in verse 12 and destroys, look at this in verse 13, destroys Solomon's grove. The king defiled the high places east of Jerusalem to the south of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon the king had built for Ashtoreth. It tells us how long some of these things had persisted, all the way from Solomon's day. You go down to verse 15, and he destroys the altar at Bethel that had been built by Jeroboam. Dan, in the far north of the territory, was probably out of his reach at this point. But Bethel to the south, in the territory of Simeon, he's able to go in and defile that and dispose of that. Moreover, come down here to verse 16 and go back to 1 Kings chapter 13. In verse 16, Josiah turned, he saw the tombs that were on the mount. He sent and took the bones out of the tombs and burned them on the altar and defiled it according to the word of the Lord the man of God had proclaimed, who predicted these things. Well, that takes us back to chapter 13, the 23rd year of Joash, the son of Ahaziah. Jehoahaz began to reign over Israel. And here we have the prophecy of the defiling of all of these things 300 plus years in advance. And notice, even Josiah's name is mentioned here. Predictive prophecy is one of the fulfilled predictive prophecy is one of the strongest evidences of the inspiration of the Bible. So he removes the houses of the high places that are in Samaria. He's moving north into the Israelite territory, trying to remove things that his people would have been aware of and would have been tempted by. Come down here to verse 20. And notice he sacrificed. Some translations simply say he slew, but that doesn't do it justice. He sacrificed all the priests of the high places who were there on the altars and burned human bones on them. And then he returned to Jerusalem. Jump down to verse 24, the next paragraph. In verses 21 to 23, he commanded the people, keep the Passover. In the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. Notice verse 22, no such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges. That doesn't say they had never kept the Passover, but they had not been diligent about it for hundreds of years. And now they're going to do it right. And verse 24, he even purges out witchcraft and necromancy and so forth. Somebody start to say something. Okay. The Passover is reinstated. Flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 35 for just a minute, because you have a lot more detail here in 2 Chronicles 35. Josiah kept a Passover to the Lord in Jerusalem, slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the first month, appointed the priests to their offices, encouraged them in the service of the house of the Lord, said to the Levites who taught all Israel and who were holy to the Lord, put the holy ark in the house that Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, built. You need not carry it on your shoulders. Now serve the Lord your God and his people Israel. Prepare yourselves according to your father's houses by your divisions, as prescribed in the writing of David, king of Israel, and the document of Solomon his son. Stand in the holy place. In other words, in all of this, do it right, do it right, do it right, do it right. And notice at verse 7, Josiah contributed to the lay people as Passover offerings, lambs, young goats, 30,000 and 3,000 bulls from the king's possessions. And look at verse 8 in 2 Chronicles 35. His officials contributed willingly to the people, to the priests, to the Levites. Hilkiah, Zechariah, and Jehiel, the chief officers, gave to the priests for the Passover offerings 2,600 Passover lambs and 300 bulls. Conaniah also, and Shemaiah and Nethanel, his brothers, and Hashabiah and Yael and Jozabad, the chiefs of the Levites, gave 5,000 lambs and young goats and 500 bulls. They hadn't seen sacrifices like this probably since the day that Solomon dedicated the temple. They did all of this in order to try and correct things, get people back on the right track. Come down to 2 Chronicles 35 and verse 16. So all the service of the Lord was prepared that day to keep the Passover, to offer burnt offerings on the altar, according to the command of King Josiah. The people who were present kept the Passover at that time and the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days. No Passover like it had been kept in Israel since the days of Samuel the prophet. Now, think about that. That includes the days of David and the lifetime of Solomon. Even in their lives, they had not been this focused. And this takes place in the 18th year of Josiah's reign. So he's 26 at this point. Yeah, 26. Profound influence of a young, righteous man. But come back over to 2 Kings chapter 22 and notice the as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. In 2 Kings 22, you look down to verses 26 through 28. We're in 23, not 22. Looked at that number. Wait a minute, there's not a 26 in that chapter. We're in chapter 23. In 26 through 28 in 2 Kings 23, God still has it in mind to punish Judah for their sins dating back to Manasseh's day. And The rest of the story in verses 29 and 30 is that Josiah dies. And we look at this, and it's puzzling to our thinking. Why would God allow Josiah to die at this point when so much good is going on? The rest of the acts of Josiah, all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. King Josiah went to meet him, and Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo as soon as he saw him. And his servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo, brought him to Jerusalem, buried him in his own tomb. The people took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, anointed him and made him king in his father's place. He was 23 years old when he became king. Well, why is it that God allows Josiah to die seemingly an untimely death, just as things are really starting to get straightened out? I mean, Jeremiah is just really well engaged in his prophetic work. He is known and honored and welcomed in the palace and so forth. And then God takes him out of the way, takes Josiah out. He's only 39 years old. He's a young man.
He had promised Josiah, I believe, that he would not witness the destruction that was already determined.
Okay, number one, God had promised Josiah, I'm not going to do this in your lifetime. This judgment is coming, and you can't turn it aside, but I'm not going to do it in your lifetime. You're not going to have to suffer through it and see it. Why didn't he let Josiah die a natural death? Why didn't he let him live? His grandfather reigned 55 years. Why didn't he let him live a long, full life? All the other things
The time had come.
that had come to fruition. The time had come. That's right. God takes him out of the way. Now he dies in battle against Pharaoh Necho. What do you learn from Josiah's life? Let me offer you four thoughts to play with, you might say. Number one, a young man can be righteous and accomplish great good for God. You look at Josiah in 2 Kings chapter 21 and chapter 22. Josiah starts very young. He has good guidance, and that sets the course of his life. And he can accomplish great things. Number two, look at 2 Kings 22, 9 through 13. The impact of the law on a good and honest heart. Not everybody is going to respond to the word of God in a positive way. Some people reject. Think about Paul in Acts chapter 17 on Mars Hill. You look at verses 30 and 31, and Paul talking about the idol or the statue to the unknown God. This is the God you need to know about. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all men everywhere to repent, because he's appointed a day in which he'll judge the world. He'll measure the world by the man whom he has appointed. And how did the people react? He's on Mars Hill. He's at the pinnacle, the intellectual center of the world. And how did the people react? Some of them said, we want to hear more. And some of them poked fun and made fun of him. The law has a good effect on a good and honest heart. But the condition of the heart determines the impact of the law. Number three, godliness delivered Josiah from the consequences of Manasseh's sins. Go back over here and you look at verses 26, 27, 28 in 2 Kings chapter 23. Nevertheless, what? because of the sins of Manasseh, God is going to bring judgment on Judah. But because Josiah is godly, Josiah does not have to suffer through that. God takes him out of the way. Number 4, prophecy is always fulfilled. Josiah had been prophesied by name over 300 years before he was born. And God fulfilled that prophecy. No ifs, ands, or buts. So, just some things to think about in that connection. So, let's talk about Jehoahaz, his son. We pick up in chapter 23. Jehoahaz began to reign in his place. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah, and he's evil. How does a righteous man have an evil son? Well, we've seen this over and over and over among the kings of Judah, haven't we? Godly king has a wicked son. Hezekiah was Manasseh's father. It's much easier in some ways for an evil son to spring from an evil father than it is for a righteous son to spring from an evil father. It's easier for a righteous son to come from a righteous king, a righteous father. But here, Jehoahaz is unrighteous. Notice it says he reigned 3 months, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and Pharaoh, the Egyptian ruler, takes him prisoner, puts him in bonds at Riblah in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem, laid on the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. That's a lot of money. And made Eliakim, his brother, the son of Josiah, another of Josiah's sons, king in his place, changed his name to Jehoiakim. Took Jehoahaz away to Egypt. That's the last we see of him. He dies in Egypt. Jehoiakim, the younger brother, or the next brother, Eliakim was his proper name, paid the taxes to Pharaoh. And how did he get the money? The way every politician does. Taxed the land, exacted the silver and the gold of the people of the land from everyone according to his assessment to give it to Pharaoh Necho. He was 25 when he began to reign, so he wasn't the younger brother, he's an older brother. 25 when he began to reign, reigned 11 years. His mother's name was Zebedah, daughter of Pedaiah of Rumah. And guess what kind of king he is? Just like his brother. Good for nothing, evil. Now, Josiah is the last righteous king in Judah. We have Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, Zedekiah. 4 kings after Josiah, and they're just, every one of them, as bad as the one before. Jehoahaz is evil, Jehoiakim is evil, Jehoiachin is evil, Zedekiah is evil. All of them turning away from the Lord. Zedekiah not only is evil, but he's spineless as well. He's a coward. We'll get to that in a little bit. It's in the days of Jehoiakim. Now, time-wise, we're at about 610, 609, 608 BC, that Pharaoh and the Assyrians are in conflict. But what's happening at this time on the world stage is that the Assyrian Empire is coming apart from within, because for no logical earthly reason, the Babylonians are consuming the Assyrian Empire from within. For 100 years and more, the Babylonians have been the handmaiden, basically, of the Assyrian Empire. From the days of Tiglath-Pileser and Shalmaneser and Sennacherib and so forth, the Assyrian Empire, I think we talked about this last week, has viewed itself as the husband to Babylon's wife, but the Assyrians are very much in control. They recognize the Babylonians as a great and ancient culture and so forth. This is what the archaeologists call the Neo-Assyrian Empire. It's not the first Assyrian Empire, but they dominate the Babylonians. The Babylonians aren't too keen on that, and they really, really, really dislike this imagery that the Assyrians like so much of Assyria and Nineveh as the husband and Chaldea and Babylon as the wife. They don't like that imagery at all. And it's Nabopolassar of the Babylonians who begins the process of consuming the Assyrian Empire from within. It's a rebellion from within that ends up with the Babylonians taking control. And the Assyrian Empire basically morphs into the Babylonian Empire. The Assyrian rulership is taken out of the way, and all of the territory and all of the conquests and all of the taxation and all of the military might that the Assyrians have wielded just passes right into the hands of the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. So, in the days of Jehoiakim, chapter 24, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Now, go back for a minute to Josiah. Let's go back before we get into these last kings. Josiah dies in battle with the Egyptians. Pharaoh was not at war with Judah per se. He was passing through Judah's territory, passing up the coastal highway basically to go to war with the Assyrians. You look over at 2 Chronicles chapter 35 and notice there in verses 20 through 27, he's directed in this, or he's guided in this by the Lord. This is of the Lord. This is part of God's purpose to remove Josiah from the picture. This is, it strikes us as a astonishing way to do it, but this is God's way of getting Josiah out of the picture, of keeping his promise for Josiah not to see the suffering of his people. So you pick up when Josiah had prepared the temple, 2 Chronicles 35 verse 20, Necho, king of Egypt, went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates. Josiah went out to meet him, but he sent envoys to him saying, "What have we to do with each other, king of Judah? I'm not coming against you this day, but against the house with which I am at war. God has commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing God who is with me, lest he destroy you." Nevertheless, Josiah did not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but came to fight in the plain of Megiddo. The archers shot King Josiah. The king said to his servants, "Take me away, I'm badly wounded." They took him out of the chariot, carried him in his second chariot, brought him to Jerusalem, and he died, was buried in the tombs of his fathers. All Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. Jeremiah also uttered a lament for Josiah. And all the singing men and singing women have spoken of Josiah in their laments to this day. They made these a rule in Israel. Behold, they're written in the laments. Now the rest of the acts of Josiah, his good deeds, etc., are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And it's at this point that the nation declines. The Battle of Carchemish is where the power of the Egyptian kingdom, not really an empire at this point, but the Battle of Carchemish is where the power of the Egyptians as any kind of appreciable military power is broken once and for all. The Egyptians roll over Josiah, but they can't roll over the Babylonians. The Egyptians, Pharaoh Necho, puts Jehoahaz on the throne. And because Josiah went out to meet him and slowed him down, he puts Judah to tribute. but he is not going to be able to maintain his hold over Judah for any length of time, because as his power is broken at Carchemish, the power of the Babylonians is rising in Assyria, and what we know as the Assyrian Empire is now becoming the Babylonian Empire. So the control from here on out is not Egypt, but Babylon. The Egyptians, through the reigns of Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin and Zedekiah, the Egyptians will try to undermine Babylonian influence, because it is a long way from Babylon all the way over to Judah and Jerusalem. And they're geographically closer to Egypt. So the Egyptian rulers are always going to be trying to incite not just the Jews, but the Moabites, the Edomites, all the other people around, the Philistines and so forth, that are in tribute to the Babylonians. They're always going to be trying to incite them and stir up trouble and cause problems for the Babylonians. But they don't really have the military power to stand up to the Babylonians. They just happen to be far enough away that they can make trouble without it really costing them anything. The Babylonians aren't going to go that far down across the Sinai into Egypt. It's just too far to go, basically, to fight the Egyptians. But as long as they can keep them in their box, basically, they're no threat. And that's the circumstance that leads to the change in domination from the Egyptians in the days of Jehoahaz to the Babylonians in the days of Jehoiakim. So we come back over here. Jehoahaz is evil. He's taken to Egypt because Pharaoh's right there. He's passing through, and before he even gets through the territory, as he's coming back licking his wounds, basically, he deposes Jehoahaz and puts Eliakim on the throne. Jehoiakim, as we know him, is an evil king. And so we come into 2 Kings chapter 24, and this corresponds to the year 606 BC. At this point, there's no more Assyrian Empire. It's now the Babylonian Empire. At this point, Sennacherib and Ben-Hadad and all those guys, they're gone. And Nebuchadnezzar is now the undisputed ruler of the Babylonian Empire. From a historical perspective, politically, militarily, culturally, there is no reason, from a human perspective, there's no reason that the Babylonians should have been able to just seize power and control the Assyrian Empire the way they did, and dominate the world for basically 100 years. But God's purpose was served by that, and that's how they were able to do it. It's a good place to stop and take a break. Questions or comments before we do? Okay, we'll come back and talk about the reigns of Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin and Zedekiah. And all right, we left off with Jehoiakim, Eliakim, the brother of Jehoahaz, becoming king in Judah. It was Pharaoh that put him there. It will be Nebuchadnezzar who will take him away. As I said before, all four of these last kings, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah, all four of the sons of Josiah are evil men. A godly father, evil sons. So, in 2 Chronicles 36, you look at verses 3 through 5, and Jehoahaz is an ungodly man. Jehoiakim follows in his footsteps. Look at verse 5. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. Against him came up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, bound him in chains to take him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried part of the vessels of the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his palace. The rest of the acts of Jehoiakim, the abominations that he did, what was found against him, are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah, and Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his place, except that Jehoiachin actually turns out to be a sibling. Now, Jehoiakim serves Babylon initially for 3 years. You look down here at chapter 24, he serves for 3 years and then becomes a rebel. Nebuchadnezzar will be patient. In 606, he will carry away Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, or as our children know them better, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He'll take away the sons of the royalty, basically, into captivity for service in the Babylonian bureaucracy. These individuals, teenagers probably at most, when they're taken into Babylon, will grow up to serve and occupy high positions in the Babylonian bureaucracy. There was method in Nebuchadnezzar's madness, so to speak. There was purpose to this in incorporating them into his administration. What he was trying to do was break down their national loyalty, their sense of identity and connection to Judah, and build into them. And he did this not just with the men of the captives from Judah, but with captives from every nation that he ruled. What he was trying to do was build into them a loyalty to himself, to Babylon. Now, they serve him faithfully, but they serve under God's rulership in his administration, and we'll see that later on. You go to the book of Daniel and you see a vivid illustration of this in the trial of the three friends with Nebuchadnezzar's image, and Daniel being put in the lion's den and so forth. All of these things are tests of faith for them, as the Babylonians are trying to reprogram them basically to worship their gods and to think of themselves not as Jews, but as Babylonians. They're trying to stamp out any cultural identity besides their own. It does not work with the Jewish people. But Jehoiakim serves only a period of time and then rebels. And punishment at verses 2 through 4 is the result of the accumulation. It's not just Jehoiakim's rebellion. It's the result of the accumulation of Manasseh's and Judah's sins. Look at chapter 24, verses 2, 3, and 4. The Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldeans, bands of the Syrians, bands of the Moabites, Ammonites, and sent them to Judah to destroy it according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servants. Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, and also for the innocent blood he had shed. He filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not pardon. The rest of the acts of Jehoiakim, all that he did, are written in the book of the kings of the Chronicles of Judah. Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiachin reigned in his place. The king of Egypt did not, notice this at verse 7, the king of Egypt did not come again out of his land, for the king of Babylon had taken all that belonged to the king of Egypt, from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. So all the territory that the Egyptians had managed to dominate during this period leading up to the Battle of Carchemish, and then in the aftermath as they're coming back to Egypt from the Battle of Carchemish, all of the territories that they had managed to dominate, the Babylonians seize control of. They're expanding their empire. Remember that they're going at one point to control 127 provinces, basically from the Mediterranean all the way to the Indian Ocean, and then north up into the steppes of Russia in some respects, all the way into parts of India proper. Now, Jehoiachin is 18, becomes king, reigns 3 months. Notice his mother's name, Nehushta. down here at verse 8, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. Jehoiachin is evil too. Nehushta, though, it's an interesting name. If you remember, that may sound sort of familiar. In Hezekiah's day, Hezekiah had destroyed the brazen serpent, the brass serpent that dated from Moses' day, from the wilderness wanderings, and he called it Nehushtan, a piece of brass. Makes you wonder about the character of this boy's mother, Nehushta, to have a name like that. Brassy woman? Who knows? Jehoiakim dies and Jehoiachin begins to rule. He's 18, he's evil, and Nebuchadnezzar is going to depose him. He's only going to reign a brief period of time. He reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar is going to exercise his power now. At this point, we're down to about 596, between 597 and 595 BC. There are 3 stages to the deportation of the Jews under the Babylonians. The first takes place when Daniel and his companions are basically taken as insurance to try to guarantee Jehoiakim's good behavior in 606 BC. The second stage takes place about 597 BC, so actually perhaps a couple of years before Jehoiachin actually becomes king. And that's where think of them as the middle class and the tradesmen are taken away into captivity. This is when Ezekiel and his wife are taken into captivity down to the river Kibar, or the Kibar Canal in Babylon, or outside of Babylon. And in the days of King Zedekiah in 586, then the final stage of deportation is going to take place. This is when the Babylonian army comes in. Zedekiah and the Jews resist, and the Babylonians lay siege to the city of Jerusalem. And when they do break in, they demolish the city, including the temple. And those folks are taken into captivity as slaves. Now, in 606, when Daniel and his companions and the children of the nobility class and so forth, when they go into captivity, they are captives, but they're not slaves. And there's an important distinction here. They are schooled, they're educated, they're trained in all the wisdom of the Babylonians and put into positions of authority in the Babylonian government. In 597, 596, when Ezekiel and his wife and the middle class basically are taken into captivity, they're deported, but they're not deported as slaves. Much like the Israelites were taken into Assyrian captivity 150 years before, 130 years before, 721 BC. These folks are simply uprooted and moved into Babylonian territory. They're allowed to own property, they're allowed to own houses, they're allowed to build businesses and have farms and so forth. They're allowed to work for themselves and buy and sell and so forth. What they're not allowed to do is live in their native land, in the promised land. And again, the purpose of that is to try to break down their tie, their attachment to their native land, and therefore to their native rulers, their kings, and to their native God. And Nebuchadnezzar, just like the Assyrians before him, Nebuchadnezzar has done this with all of the peoples that he has conquered. The difference is that Nebuchadnezzar basically doesn't ever get around to moving another captured people into Judah after the destruction in 586. There will still be people there. There will be Edomites who become known as Idumeans by the 1st century. And there will be the leftovers of Judah, but Nebuchadnezzar is not going to actually colonize the territory of Judah, because God is going to send Judah back there at the end of captivity. So they keep that land basically vacant during the balance of the captivity years. So Jehoiachin, evil man, reigns 3 months. This is about 596 or so, thereabouts, in this period of the second deportation. And the 19th of 20 kings of Judah, the last legitimate king, in a sense. Zedekiah, who's going to succeed him, is actually his uncle. Look down here to chapter 24 at verse 10. The servants of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came up to Jerusalem. The city was besieged. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, gave himself up to the king of Babylon, himself, his mother, his servants, his officials, his palace officials. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign, and carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord, which Solomon had made, as the Lord had foretold, carried away all Jerusalem, all the officials and the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, all the craftsmen and the smiths, none remained except the poorest of the people, carried away Jehoiachin to Babylon, the king's mother, wives, officials, chief men of the land he took into captivity. And the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon all the men of valor, 7,000, and the craftsmen and metal workers, 1,000, all of them strong and fit for war. And the king made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. So all of the last kings related. Zedekiah is the last, he is part of the family, but he's not actually in the lineage. Jehoiachin, however, also known as Jeconiah, also known as Coniah, Jehoiachin did have sons, but none of them ever reigned in Jerusalem. Take your Bible and flip over to Jeremiah for just a moment, and notice in Jeremiah chapter 22, Jeremiah is chronicling this event of Jehoiachin being taken captive. And in Jeremiah chapter 22, start at verse 24 and make a note of this. Jeremiah describes Jehoiachin with the name Coniah, which is short for Jeconiah, another name for Jehoiachin. And here is God's prophecy concerning him. As I live, declares the Lord, though Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were the signet ring on my right hand, yet I would tear you off and give you into the hand of those who seek your life, into the hand of those of whom you are afraid, even into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of the Chaldeans. I will hurl you and the mother who bore you into another country where you were not born, and there you shall die. But to the land which they will long to return, they shall not return. Is this man Coniah, Jehoiachin, a despised broken pot, a vessel no one cares for? Why are he and his children hurled and cast into a land that they do not know? O earth, 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 or newer translations would say, oh, land, land, land. Hear the word of the Lord. And the land there, the earth there, is not all the earth, but rather Judah. Pay attention. Thus says the Lord, write this man childless, a man who shall not succeed in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah. Now, this is important for two reasons. Number one, we read that statement in verse 30, write this man down as childless. Oh, he must not have any children. Wait a minute. Keep reading. none of his offspring, doesn't say he'll never have children. It says none of his offspring, his descendants, will prosper or succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah. The connotation of that expression, write this man childless, is not he has no children. It's a figure of speech that says he's desolate, as in 2 Kings 24:8, 1 Chronicles chapter 35, verses 17 and 18. This man did have sons, but none of them would ever rule. He would have no royal heir, no ruling heir. Look over at Matthew chapter 1 for just a minute. In the lineage of Jesus, in Matthew chapter 1, what do you find? Notice down here, as we go along through the lineage of Jesus, David, at verse 6, David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, Solomon the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah, Abijah the father of Asaph, Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, etc., 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 etc. Get down here to verse 11, Josiah the father of Jeconiah, Jehoiachin, Coniah, all the same person, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And look at verse 12. After the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiad, etc., 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 etc. And we get down to verse 16, Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. Jeconiah, Coniah, Jehoiachin had sons, and Shealtiel, son of Jeconiah or Jehoiachin, is the lineage through whom the Savior comes. So when Jeremiah says, write him childless, it doesn't mean he has no children at all. He is desolate. His sons will not sit on the throne in Jerusalem and rule. Okay. Who is the son of Jeconiah? 10 generations, 15 generations removed. Jesus. God, through Jeremiah, says Jehoiachin's sons will not prosper, will not succeed in ruling on David's throne in Judah. What's the fundamental requirement of premillennialism in our world today? Oh, God still owes them some territory, and Jesus has to come and reign for 1,000 years in Jerusalem over his people. If Jesus ever sets foot in Jerusalem again, Jeremiah is a liar. If Jesus ever reigns in Jerusalem for even a moment, Jeremiah is a liar. But that's the fundamental requirement of premillennialism, and most Protestantism and a lot of Catholicism is eaten up with premillennial belief that the Jews remain God's special people, that God owes them some territory that they did not get, because you look at the boundaries God laid out and you look at the boundaries that they actually inhabited, well, they could have had more. But every single tribe stopped short of what God promised them. God didn't fail, they did. And God left people in the territory to test them. But they say, the millennialists say, God owes them territory and Jesus has to reign on David's throne. If he ever does, God's a liar, because Jeremiah said that'll never, never happen. Millennialism is false in its fundamental assumptions. So, Babylon's rule during this period extends all the way to the border of Egypt. Now, that's not to say that the Babylonians have troops on the Egyptian border, but they control all of the kingdoms, all of the vassal kings and territories right down to the Sinai Peninsula. And the Egyptians are no threat to them. But the Egyptians still are going to whisper in Zedekiah's ear and promise support and encourage rebellion and so forth, even in Zedekiah's reign. Now, we're in the 590s at this point. This is when Zedekiah becomes king, 597 roughly. And here's where, as I said, Ezekiel and all of the middle class and the rest of the upper class folks are deported to Babylon, along with all the treasure and the army and so forth. So we look down here. Mattaniah is the new king. His name is changed to Zedekiah. 21 years old when he became king, reigns 11 years, 597 to 586. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. Seen that name before, haven't we? Goes back to Jehoiakim. So he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Anger of the Lord came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah. He cast them out from his presence. And notice what it says at the end of verse 20. Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. The king of Babylon, the Babylonian emperor, Nebuchadnezzar, makes you king over your people, and you rebel. Here's the Egyptians meddling and trying to cause trouble for the Babylonians. It's with their encouragement. He rebels against the Babylonians. They don't pay their taxes. When it says he rebelled, he didn't raise an army and go to battle. He just didn't pay his taxes and didn't obey and wasn't faithful, and he winds up being the last king, the last ruler in Jerusalem, last king in Judah. Look at 2 Chronicles 36 again, and notice at verses 13 through 20, you have really the summary of all of this. You start at verse 13, he rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God. So he violated his oath before God, stiffened his neck, hardened his heart against turning to the Lord, the God of Israel. Now that's interesting, because Jeremiah knows all of these guys. Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, Zedekiah, even Gedaliah, the governor that will be appointed after Zedekiah is taken away. Jeremiah knows all of these guys. And during Zedekiah's 11 years on the throne, even though Jeremiah is persecuted and unwelcome, time and time again, we see Zedekiah turning to him for information, turning to him for explanation, but refusing to do what Jeremiah tells him to do. In fact, in the final conflict where Jerusalem is under siege, Jeremiah is imprisoned not by Zedekiah, but by his advisors, who accuse Jeremiah of treason. Because what's Jeremiah's message? This is from the Lord. You need to lay down your arms. You need to surrender and go peacefully into captivity, because this is from the Lord. This is not the power of Nebuchadnezzar. This is the power of God. And that's not what they want to hear. So they arrest him and charge him with treason. Nebuchadnezzar is going to wind up delivering Jeremiah, but we'll talk about that more next week. Look down here at 2 Chronicles 36. All the officers of the priests, the people, verse 14, were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nation. They polluted the house of the Lord that he had made holy in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people in his dwelling place. They kept mocking. They kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words, scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. Boy, you can make a sermon out of that, Brother Sam. Until there was no remedy. You've gone so far that there's no going back. Therefore, he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young men or virgin, old man or aged, gave them all into his hand, the vessels of the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king and of his princes. All these he brought to Babylon, and they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its palaces with fire and destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So, all this time that they've been unfaithful, God's been keeping records. God's been taking names. God has noticed and paid attention. And God is going to judge them. Zedekiah, Mattaniah is his proper name, the last ruler, and the wickedness that he permits, that he enables, that he participates in, is the cause of their ultimate ruin. In chapter 25, here in 2 Kings, you have the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of Judah, in the 9th year of his reign. So 597 down to 588, 9 years. On the 10th, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar comes and lays siege against Jerusalem. It's going to take a while to break down Jerusalem. They built siege works all around it, and they were under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe there's no food, and a breach was made in the city, and all the men of war fled by night, by way of the gate between the two walls, by the king's gardens. So they've given up at this point. They're trying to escape. In the meantime, the Edomites to their south and to their east. The Edomites, their blood kinfolks, descendants of Esau, are doing a catch and release program. They're catching fleeing Jews and releasing them to the Babylonians. They're not helping at all. And they're going to come in and plunder Judah, take advantage of the situation. Obadiah prophesies against the Edomites. The little short book of Obadiah is a prophecy against the Edomites. And the point that Obadiah makes is, you took advantage of this situation for yourselves instead of helping out your kinfolks. You saw this as an opportunity to enrich yourselves, and you treated your kinfolks, Judah, as evil. You took advantage of them. God is going to punish you because of this. And what happens to the Edomites? In the days after the restoration, in the days after Alexander the Great, so in the 4th century BC, the 300s, down into the 200s, down into the 2nd century in the 100s, in the days of the Maccabees, when the priests ruled in Judah, family of Judas Maccabeus, the Jews are going to have about a 40-year window of relative independence. And during that time, they are going to conquer and oppress as many of their neighbors as they can, including the Edomites. And the Edomites, now known as the Idumeans at that point, are never going to exist as a separate independent nation again. Obadiah foretold God would would take their nation away. They think they dwell securely in the cleft of the rock, and God's going to take them down. But they're not done away. Because in the 1st century BC, the father of Herod the Great makes an alliance with the royal family of Judah. Now, they're not ruling, but Herod winds up marrying a Jewish princess. And then with Roman support and Roman soldiers, becomes the appointed Roman king in Judah, just in time for Jesus to be born. But in the meantime, these folks, these Edomites, they're taking advantage of the situation and despoiling Judah. So Jerusalem is under siege. Jerusalem is basically the last holdout at this point. The whole territory is already under Babylonian control. And so the king is captured. They went in the direction that those that are trying to escape, they're trying to go south into the desert to the Arabah. The army of the Chaldeans, verse 5, pursued the king, overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his army was scattered from him. They captured the king, brought him to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and passed sentence on him. Now, what were they trying him for? You swore an oath before your God. Back over here in the early part of the chapter. You swore an oath before your God to be faithful and loyal, to pay your taxes and to be a faithful subject, and you violated your oath. So they passed sentence on him. Look at verse 7. They slaughtered his sons before his eyes, and then put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him in chains and took him to Babylon. Flip over to Ezekiel chapter 12 for just a minute. Ezekiel chapter 12, Ezekiel foretells this in verse 13. Ezekiel is giving an image, a symbol of Judah's captivity. And at verse 7, God had told him, you take your baggage, you go out, you act like a fugitive, you act this out like a fugitive going into captivity. So verse 7, I did as I was commanded. I brought out my baggage by day as baggage for exile. In the evening, I dug through the wall with my own hands, brought out my baggage at dusk, carrying it on my shoulder in their sight. In the morning, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, has not the house of Israel, the rebellious house, said to you, what are you doing? Say to them, thus says the Lord God, this oracle concerns the prince in Jerusalem and all the house of Israel who are in it. Say, I am a sign for you. As I have done, so shall it be done to them. They shall go into exile, into captivity. Look at verses 12 and 13. And the prince who is among them shall lift his baggage upon his shoulder at dusk and shall go out. They shall dig through the wall to bring him out through it. He shall cover his face that he may not see the land with his eyes. And I will spread my net over him. He shall be taken in my snare. I will bring him to Babylon, to the land of the Chaldeans. Yet he shall not see it. Why? Back over here, they brought him to Riblah. They passed sentence on him. They executed his sons, and then they blinded him. So he goes into Babylon, but he never sees it. And he shall die there. And I will scatter toward every wind all who are around him, his helpers and his troops, unsheath the sword after them, and they shall know that I am the Lord. So, here in chapter 25, they have conquered Jerusalem. They have captured and tried the king, executed his sons, and sent him to Babylon. Notice what then takes place. Nebuchadnezzar sends Nebuzaradan, his general, to complete the job. They've conquered the city, but now they're going to obliterate it. In the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, captain of the bodyguard, a servant of the king, came to Jerusalem, burned the house of the Lord, burned the king's house, burned all the houses of Jerusalem, every great house. All the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem, and the rest of the people who were left in the city, and the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babylon, together with the rest of the multitude, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried into exile. But notice this in verse 12. The captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. They go through the captives, and Jeremiah shows us this. We'll talk about this more next week. They go through the captives, and basically anybody that has any monetary value that they can sell as a slave, they're going to chain up and march away to Babylon, because these people had fought back when they should have surrendered. But the folks that aren't worth the cost of transport, that's really who these poorest of the land are. The folks that have no monetary value to them, they're going to leave behind. These are the people that Jeremiah chooses to stay with. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar has Jeremiah rescued and gives him his liberty and says, you can come to Babylon with me and I will feed you. I'll take care of you. You have advocated for me, and I recognize that. You've spoken for God on my behalf, and I'll take care of you if that's what you want. If you want to stay here, you can stay here. Jeremiah stays with these dregs of society people, and they run away to Egypt out of fear of the Babylonians, because some of the deserters who had not been captured murdered Gedaliah, the governor that Nebuchadnezzar appointed. So Nebuchadnezzar, after they've captured Jerusalem, now he sends Nebuzaradan in to burn the temple, burn the palace, burn all the houses, break down the walls, and take the people away. Take everything of any value. Take the chief priests, take the king's counselors, remove the army, verse 19, the men of war. Everybody, the chief priests, the king's counselors, and the remainder of the men of war here at verses 18 and 19. You look down here, these are executed. The captain of the guard took Sariah, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the second priest, the 3 keepers of the threshold from the city, an officer who had been in command of the men of war, 5 men of the king's council, the secretary of the commander of the army, 60 men of the people of the land who were found in the city, took them, brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and the king struck them down, put them to death at Riblah in the land of Hamath. So Judah was taken into exile out of its land. So these last people are executed, and the captivity, as we read in 2 Chronicles 36, is actually a Sabbath for the land. Now think about this. What were they supposed to do from the days of Joshua until now? Every 7 years.
Every 7 years they were to rest the land.
They were supposed to let the land lie fallow for a year, a Sabbath year. What was supposed to happen every 50th year?
That was the year of the Jubilee, and anyone who was a slave was set free, and it seems like land that belonged to a family was redeemed. And
that was the Sabbath of Sabbaths, the Jubilee year. Slaves went free. Land that had changed hands went back to the original family, so that no name was blotted out, no inheritance was lost in Israel. The land was to lie fallow 2 years in a row. And if you notice, there's no record in the scriptures of the people keeping the Sabbath year or the Jubilee year. But you get over here, 2 Chronicles 36, 70 years of Sabbaths, 70 years of the land lying fallow, basically, because they had not kept their obligation. They had not kept their responsibility before the Lord. And the interesting thing about that is to think even of the good kings in Judah, men like David and Solomon in his early years, men like Jehoash and Hezekiah and Josiah. Did they not keep the Sabbath year? If they did, there's no record of it. There's no record that they ever actually did it. So, Nebuchadnezzar, Jeremiah and Ezekiel both point out he is God's servant. And of course, that gets Zedekiah's counselors all in an uproar for Jeremiah to say something like that. But Nebuchadnezzar, God's servant for this purpose, purifies the land. And this is the fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy back in Jeremiah chapter 25. Now, come down to the last couple of paragraphs in 2 Kings 25. At verse 22, over the people who remain, you've got just the leftovers of society, the folks that have no real material value to the Babylonians. So they're going to leave them behind. It's not worth what it costs to feed them to take them to Babylon. So he appointed Gedaliah, the son of Jehoiakim, son of Shaphan, governor. Basically, the only person of any nobility left in the land is Gedaliah. When the captains and their men heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah governor, they came with their men to Gedaliah at Mizpah, namely Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and Johanan, the son of Kareah, and Sariah, the son of Tanhumeth, the Netophathite, and Yaazaniah, the son of Maacathite. And Gedaliah swore to them and to their men, do not be afraid because of the Chaldean officials. All right, who are these people that come to meet him? Well, they seem to be soldiers who have deserted, run away, people who are living like renegades. These are not necessarily the dregs of the people, but they're folks that have not been captured. And the message is, fine, you're here, live in peace. Don't worry about the Babylonians. Serve the king of Babylon and it'll be well with you. God will take care of you. You've been spared, let it be. And in the 7th month, Ishmael takes 10 men and goes down and murders Gedaliah. Put him to death along with the Jews and Chaldeans who were with him at Mizpah. Now, why are they at Mizpah? Think about this. They're at Mizpah because there's no more Jerusalem. They have no capital, so they're settled at Mizpah. They murder Gedaliah. Now, why would these guys murder Gedaliah and all the people that are with him?
Do they think they're going to be able to? I don't know. They're still rebellious, but it just seems like, why are they still rebelling? Haven't they gotten the message yet? But I don't know that that's the case.
Well, that's as good an explanation as any. These are not. Nebuchadnezzar left the dregs of society there to look after the land, basically. Those people, as Jeremiah will show us, take it upon themselves to think, well, God let us stay here because we're the only ones who are righteous. And Jeremiah quickly disabuses them of that notion that they're not righteous at all. You're here because you're worthless to the Babylonians. You're not here because you're good and godly. You're here because you don't have any value to the Babylonians. In the meantime, here are these guys, Ishmael and his companions, who are basically, they're brigands. They're Jews, some of them probably deserters from the army, or those few that have escaped, but they've turned to a life of brutality, basically. They're not interested in serving the Babylonians. And so they murdered Babylonian officials. They murdered Gedaliah, who is a Babylonian official. And notice the impact of what they did. All the people, small and great, the captains of the forces arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. They were afraid that the Babylonians would come back and take vengeance on them, and rightly so, because the Babylonians would have. Gedaliah is made governor. Ishmael and his companions are told, look, just settle down. Let God take care of you. Their actions, though, are an expression of faithlessness to God. They are not willing to serve Nebuchadnezzar, even though it's God who has put Nebuchadnezzar in this position. Now, the interesting thing is the last little statement here, verses 27, 28, 29, 30, about Jehoiachin, Jeconiah, Coniah. In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah. So he's been a prisoner most of his life now. In the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, evil Merodach, not Nebuchadnezzar, but his successors, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison, spoke kindly to him, gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So he puts him in a position of some honor above the other vassal kings that are captives there, and put off his prison garments. Every day of his life from that point on, he dines at the king's table. He receives a king's allowance for the rest of his life. And that's a partial fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy over in Jeremiah chapter 27. If you flip over there for a minute, Jeremiah 27 in verses 12 and 13, Jeremiah has dealt with Jehoiachin. Now remember, in 22, he said, write this man childless, no descendant will prosper ruling on the throne of David and Judah. But over here in Jeremiah 27, in verses 12 and 13, to Zedekiah, king of Judah, I spoke in like manner. Bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him and his people and live. Why will you and your people die? By the sword, by famine, by pestilence, as the Lord has spoken concerning any nation that will not serve the king of Babylon. Do not listen to the words of the prophets who are saying, you shall not serve the king of Babylon, for it is a lie that they are prophesying to you. Now, think about Jehoiachin's circumstances and his experience in Babylonian captivity in the light of Hebrews chapter 12. What do we read in Hebrews chapter 12 about the way God deals with his people? Discipline is evidence of what?
Love.
If God doesn't discipline you, it's because he doesn't care about you. If God doesn't discipline you, that says God doesn't love you. Well, who wants to be unloved by God? Now you come to 2 Chronicles 36 to the end of the chapter, and in 2 Chronicles, because we are chronicling the kings of Judah and ultimately the lineage of the Savior, the last paragraph of 2 Chronicles 36 gives us the proclamation of Cyrus, who has succeeded the Babylonian Empire. In 539 BC, the Medo-Persian rulers who had been under the thumb of the Babylonians made a coalition. The Medes and the Persians put together a coalition and ultimately overthrew the Babylonians and did to them what they had done to the Assyrians. They just took over the empire. And so we go from an Assyrian empire to a Babylonian Chaldean empire to a Medo-Persian empire, and Cyrus, the ruler, issues a decree. Now, the Medo-Persians are significant because their approach is fundamentally different in how they deal with conquered nations, fundamentally different from the Assyrians and the Babylonians before them and the Syrians before that and others even prior to that. The Medo-Persians are not intent on trying to convert everybody to their thinking and to their way of life. What they want is basically, y'all go home and be happy and prosperous, pay your taxes, and we'll take care of you. So they give permission. Cyrus gives the decree. Anyone of Judah and the other tribes of Israel who wants to can go home. 536 BC, at the end of the 70 years, 606 to 536, 70 years of domination by the Babylonian Empire, ending in the Medo-Persians. Anyone who wants to can go home. Over the next couple of decades, basically, really over the next 100 years, but over the next couple of decades, how many people actually return?
Did you not say just a small percentage?
Yep. If you tally them all up in Ezra and Nehemiah, you have about 50,000 or so who actually return to the promised land, to Jerusalem. And the nation of Judah for the next 100 years, basically, amounts to about 20 or 30 square miles centered around Jerusalem. It's nothing like what it had been. It's a pathetic little copy. When they do finally, years later, decades later, they get the temple completed, what they have is a poor man's copy of Solomon's temple. It's nothing like the glory and the grandeur of Solomon's temple. And those who can remember Solomon's temple from their childhood, and remember this, the guys that can remember Solomon's temple, what they're remembering is Solomon's temple after it has been plundered several times. And, the golden shields and the gold from the temple have already been removed. So it's not even the grandeur or the grandioseness of Solomon's era. It's just what was left in their lifetimes. But what they're looking at now in the reconstruction is a poor man's copy of that. In the Holy of Holies, there's no Ark of the Covenant. There's a limestone block as a placeholder. The Ark of the Covenant's never seen again. It spent several years in a U.S. government warehouse in Virginia, according to Indiana Jones.
Yeah. Oh, and it was in Germany for a while for them. Yeah.
All that stuff. But the Ark of the Covenant disappears, never seen again. That placeholder was still there in Jesus' day, as far as we know.
Well, I think you discussed this in one of the earlier lessons, but I've always heard the Jews ridiculed for not returning to Jerusalem. But then when you were presenting the fact that the Jews were all over the known world, how that set the stage for Christ to come and for the apostles and for Paul. And so it just reminds me, I think we need to be careful deciding when to criticize people.
But you look at the impact of captivity on not just Judah, but on Israel, all the 12 tribes. By the time that Judah goes into captivity, it starts in 606, and the whole nation basically is in captivity by 586. By the time they go into captivity, the other tribes have already been in captivity for about 120 years. 721, well, 115 years, 721 down to 606. So Israel, by the time Cyrus's decree comes along, the northern tribes have been in captivity for almost 200 years. Judah has been in captivity for 70 years, basically about 3 generations, 2.5 to 3 generations. What is the impact of captivity on these people? They've been uprooted from their ancestral homeland. They have lived, worked, had families, owned homes, farms, businesses in places that they'd had no connection to before captivity.
Did you not say they were encouraged to do that very thing?
Absolutely. In fact, Jeremiah tells them, you pray for the health, for the well-being of the city where you are. And that's not what they want to hear when they're going into captivity. But by the time they're released, you've got entire families that have no connection that anyone living in the family can remember to the promised land. You've got generations that have grown up, lived, had children, died, who've never seen, never been there. The youngest people who've ever actually been there are grandparents and great-grandparents. So the emotional tie, and plus these people have been shuffled and moved from place to place and encouraged to incorporate into the society. And the northern tribes, for the most part, they were already in idolatry, so they have no strong incentive not to adopt the culture of the pagans around them. So by the time of the release from captivity, most of Israel, the 12 tribes, well, they're scattered all over the Assyrian, Babylonian, Medo-Persian empires. By the time of the 1st century, time of Jesus and the apostles, there is basically no place in the Roman Empire from Western India all the way to Spain and all the way north to Britain, down into sub-Saharan Africa. There is basically no place where Roman influence is felt where there's not a community of Jews. They have a reputation in the Roman Empire. They're literate, they're shrewd business people, and they're isolationists. They keep to themselves. They're resented, but they occupy high-ranking positions even in the Roman government. By the time they're allowed to return to Judah, most of them have no connection to it. Now, they give money for those who do want to return, and Cyrus apportions money from the treasury to support them. But most of them, I can't go. My family's here. My grandchildren are here. My grandparents are here. I've got to stay and take care of them and whatnot. They're firmly settled into Gentile society. Before captivity, they were largely an isolated, homogeneous people. After captivity, they're never the same because they've been exposed to the wider world. After the captivity, their native speech is no longer Aramaic or Hebrew, although they continue to speak Aramaic. Their native language for many of them becomes Greek because of the influence of Alexander and his conquest of the known world. Greek is persistent as the dominant language all the way from Alexander down to the 2nd century AD, at least, in the Roman Empire, because it's the language of commerce, it's the language of trade, it's the language of law, it's the language of philosophy, it's the language of education. And it's part of the fullness of time, Galatians 4 and verse 4, for the coming of the gospel. You started to say something, Miss Mary.
Well, it just occurred to me that you said that the Babylonians were trying to weaken the nationalism of the Jews.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, it occurs to me that God would have promoted that also, trying to get them to realize that their salvation isn't because they are Jews.
Right. What does
So
Paul say? He who is a Jew is not one who's a Jew outwardly, but one inwardly, of the heart. But the irony of that, look at Acts chapter 6, the establishment of the church, and the first dissension in the Jerusalem congregation centers around what? The apportionment of benevolent aid for the widows. And what's the problem? Now, these are, at this point, all the Christians are Jewish religiously, regardless of what tribe they're from.
weren't their widows Greek or something?
You've got the tension is between the Judean Jews, the folks that had lived there in and around Jerusalem all their lives, and the Grecian Jews. That's how they describe them, the Hellenists. In other words, the Jews, they're still Jews religiously, culturally, ethnically, their history, lineage, background, family are Jewish, Hebrew, but they've lived out in the Gentile world, on the Gentile economy. They're Greek speakers more than Hebrew or Aramaic speakers. And so the Judean Jews are taking care of their own home folks first. And some of these folks that are hundreds or thousands of miles from home, who had come for Passover and Pentecost, made the once in a lifetime pilgrimage, heard the gospel, been converted, stayed there, but they're not home folks,
Right.
being discriminated against.
Yeah.
And you have the appointment of 7 in Acts chapter 6, deacons, whether they're deacons in name or simply in function, to address that issue. Even then, in the first century, you have those that are trying to tie themselves to that real estate definition of their relationship with God instead of their faithfulness to what he tells them.
And another example of the I can't think of what it's called now, parasite.
Mhm. Yeah. Comments, thoughts, or questions? Next week, Lord willing, we're going to look a little bit at Ezekiel and Obadiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and all of these, just sort of in thumbnail fashion. And then the following week, we'll review for the final exam.
So do we have 2 classes and left or 3?
We have, if memory serves me, and let me look at the schedule, I believe this is the next to the last class. Let me find my syllabus. Here we go. The schedule is, this is April 5th. We have 2 classes left.
Okay.
19th. And the
Okay.
final exam, I will email the final exam on the 19th, and it'll be just similar to the midterm. It's a
Right.
take test, everything you've got, notes, Bible, whatever you can use, and just return it to me within that week. And
Okay.
I'll to you. By the way, did you get your midterm in the mail?
Yes, I did finally. Thank you so much.
Good. And if you've got your
I turned
thank you. That other assignment, I couldn't what it was.
I turned a paper in. You'll see when you open it up.
Okay, just I'm looking for those sometime in this next week or thereabouts. No, I'm not obsessing about the date.
Oh, okay. Well, I went ahead and turned in something tonight, but
Okay.
Anyway, you'll see. Okay.
That sounds good.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments, folks?
No, sir.
All right, ladies, Brother Sam, good to be with you. Look forward to seeing you again.
I got a question before you go, Dave. I got a question. Yeah, Jeconiah, when you were just explaining that,
Yes.
and you were saying that they wouldn't be on the throne, but when Jesus was born, and Joseph, he was in the line,
Mhm.
but Jesus wasn't in the line because he came through Mary.
Right.
So,
Right.
so
It's interesting. Matthew's lineage, I may say this backwards. Matthew's lineage follows Joseph's side of the family, which would be
okay.
the legal side.
Okay.
Luke's lineage appears to follow Mary's side of the family, which traces all the way back to Adam, connects him to God.
Okay.
So you've got both the legal side and the literal side, you might say, in Matthew and in Luke. Now I may have reversed those, but I think I've got that correct. I haven't.
Mm. But when Jeconiah couldn't rule on the throne, go through that again because I was a bit confused. I've heard it before.
Okay.
But,
Real short form.
okay.
Jehoiachin is Jeconiah is Coniah. You got three names, all refer to the same guy.
Right.
Jeconiah, Coniah, Jehoiachin, all the same guy.
Mm-hmm.
He goes into captivity in Babylon. Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 22, specifically verse 30, but basically about 27 down to the end of the chapter, Jeremiah prophesies none of Jeconiah's children can prosper or can succeed as king, ruling on David's throne.
So none of his biological descendants will be.
None of his
Okay.
none of his biological descendants, none of his lineage, and even if Matthew's record is Joseph's family, that's the legal lineage for Jesus.
Right. Okay.
So none of his descendants can rule on the throne in Jerusalem. The premillennialist folks are looking for Jesus to come back and rule for 1,000 years over an earthly political kingdom headquartered in Jerusalem on David's throne. If he does, that makes Jeremiah a liar.
Okay.
And then you look at Matthew chapter 1, well, here's Jeconiah's son, Shealtiel, who was born in captivity, who is the ancestor of Jesus. But here's the whole point is, if Jesus ever rules over an earthly kingdom, Jeremiah is a liar. Jeremiah is a false prophet. And of course, no premillennialist is going to say Jeremiah is a false prophet. They're going to try to explain that away and say, well, he didn't have any children. Matthew says he did.
Okay.
Okay. Other thoughts, questions, comments? Good night, everybody. Y'all have a good evening. Thank you for being here.
Thanks. Have a good evening.